Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to kind of get into some murky waters here with the Supreme Court case that has a lot of people talking, and it started with something seemingly pretty straightforward foreign aid, but then we get into sovereign immunity and then a judge making a really controversial decision.
Yeah, this is a very interesting situation. Uh, you have kind of a conflict here between a district court judge who's trying to force a huge payout, and then you have the government and the legal protections that the government usually has from certain lawsuits.
Right, so let's break this down a little bit for everyone. We have a group of NGOs, and that's businesses and nonprofits that receive foreign aid money, and they decided to sue the Department of State and USA.
Right.
Their argument is that the government was illegally putting a stop to their aid payments.
Exactly. And so this is where things start to get very interesting. The district court initially issued what's called a temporary restraining order, a TRO, to prevent the government from withholding those funds.
Okay.
And you would think that would be the end of it, right? Right. It seems pretty straightforward.
But that is not what happened at all.
Yeah.
The judge was not happy with how slowly the payments were being made, and so the judge took things up a notch and issued a second order demanding a payout of $2 billion to be paid within 36 hours.
Wow.
And to make matters even more complicated, the judge tried to categorize this massive payout as just another TRO, which is a way that many legal experts say to avoid review by a higher court.
Right.
So that's kind of an end around.
Yeah, that's a bold move for sure. But it sounds like someone wasn't too happy about that because this is where Justice Alito enters the picture.
Right.
And he wrote this really strongly worded dissent when the Supreme Court decided not to vacate the order. He even said that he was stunned by the situation.
Right. Justice Alito didn't hold back.
Hmm.
He basically said, does a single district court judge who may not even have the jurisdiction to be deciding this case have the power to compel the U.S. government to pay out $2 billion in taxpayer money? And his kind of follow-up to that was probably lose forever.
Hmm.
And so he made it clear that he thinks that the answer should be no.
Wow, you can feel the tension just in that statement alone.
Yeah, absolutely.
It sounds like he thinks that the judge is completely overstepping the boundaries here. But before we get into that, can we back up for a sec and talk about why the government was so against paying in the first place?
Sure. The government's main defense here was the concept of sovereign immunity.
Right.
And this is a legal doctrine that basically protects the government from being sued without its consent.
Hmm.
So think of it as a shield to prevent the government from being sued for everything under the sun.
Right.
The big question in this case is whether a specific exception to sovereign immunity, and this is found in the Administrative Procedure Act, the APA, whether this actually applies here, especially when it comes to claims for money.
Okay, so the government is basically saying, even if we did pause these payments, you can't sue us for the money because we have sovereign immunity.
Right? It's a legal tug of war over whether or not the government is obligated to pay, even if they believe their actions were lawful.
Oh.
And to understand Justice Alito's reaction, we need to kind of dig into his reasoning for why he thinks the judge overstepped.
I'm all ears, but before we do, I think it might be helpful for our listeners if we could quickly explain what the Administrative Procedure Act, or APA, actually is for people who aren't, legal scholars.
Right, that's a great point. It's easy to get lost in all the legal jargon. The APA is essentially a set of rules that governs how federal agencies operate.
Okay.
So you can think of it like a rule book for how the government makes decisions and enforces regulations. And it also includes this waiver of sovereign immunity
Right.
that we've been talking about, which allows people to sue the government under certain circumstances.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's get back to Justice Alito. What were his main arguments against what the district court judge did here?
Well, one of his biggest concerns was that the judge tried to disguise this massive $2 billion order as just a regular TRO. Remember, a TRO is supposed to be a temporary measure to prevent immediate harm while a case is being decided. It's something that you put in place quickly, usually without a full hearing.
Right. It's kind of like hitting the pause button legally.
Exactly.
So what's the big deal if the judge called it a TRO?
Well, here's where it gets interesting. Justice Alito argues that this order was far from temporary. $2 billion being paid out. That's a huge deal. And it's unlikely that the government would ever get that money back, even if they win the case later on. He's basically saying that the judge was using a TRO to force a final decision, which is, a big no-no in the legal world.
Right. Yeah, it's like trying to sneak in a game-winning goal before the other teams even had a chance to get on the field. It's not really fair play.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And this brings us to another point, that Justice Alito made the difference between a TRO and a preliminary injunction.
Okay.
So preliminary injunction is a more formal order that can last longer, and it usually involves more thorough legal process. You don't just hand those out like candy. And so what Justice Alito was saying is that the judge was trying to use this TRO loophole to avoid the stricter rules of a preliminary injunction.
Right. So kind of circumvent the process.
Exactly. He even points out that in previous cases, the Supreme Court has been very clear that if a judge wants to order the government to pay money, they have to use a preliminary injunction, not a TRO.
Okay, so Justice Alito is very clearly saying that this judge was not playing by the rules here. But wasn't there also a disagreement over whether this specific case actually qualified for the waiver of sovereign immunity under the APA?
Right.
You know, that exception that allows people to sue the government in the first place?
You're right. That's a really crucial point. The government argued that this waiver only applies to situations where someone is seeking something other than money, like, stopping the government from taking a specific action. The government is saying that the NGOs here were really ultimately after a big payout, which is not covered by the waiver.
Right. So the government is saying you can sue us to make us do something or stop doing something, but you can't just sue us to get a bunch of money.
Right. Exactly. They're saying this case is about financial compensation, which is usually off limits when it comes to suing the government.
Okay, so we have this legal battle brewing over what a TRO really is and whether this case even qualified for this exception to sovereign immunity.
Right.
But what about the NGOs?
Yeah.
What were their arguments for why they needed this money so urgently?
That's a great question. And that's something that we will delve into more deeply as we continue our deep dive. The NGOs argued that any delay in funding would cause significant harm to their operations and to the people that they serve. Remember, these are organizations that are working on crucial issues like...
Yeah, these are not just some abstract legal arguments. We're talking about real people, real programs that are being impacted by this.
Right, absolutely. And that's kind of where the NGO's argument for urgency comes into play, because they were saying that any delay in this funding could have devastating consequences for the work that they're doing. They're providing essential services, and a sudden stop to that funding could really disrupt those services and potentially cause harm to the very people they're trying to help.
Yeah, I see why they would feel like they had to act quickly.
Right.
But let's go back to Justice Alito's dissent for a second. He wasn't just disagreeing with how the judge handled this procedurally. He also seemed to have some pretty strong opinions about the actual substance of the case too, right?
Right, that's right. Justice Alito spent a good chunk of his dissent kind of picking apart the legal reasoning behind the district court's order, especially when it came to the waiver of sovereign immunity under the APA.
Right.
Remember, the government's argument was that this waiver only applies when people are seeking something other than money. And the NGOs are clearly after a payout here.
Right. It's like you can't squeeze blood from a stone, or in this case, you can't sue the government for money unless there's a specific exception that lets you do that.
Exactly. And Justice Alito's argument is that the APA's waiver just doesn't apply here at all. He points to previous Supreme Court cases that distinguish between specific relief and monetary compensation.
Okay.
So specific relief is basically when a court orders the government to do something or to stop doing something.
Okay.
Monetary compensation, on the other hand, is all about, getting paid for damages.
Right. So he's saying this is a case about money, and the APA doesn't allow you to sue the government for money in this kind of context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He argues that the judge's order was essentially a way to get around that and force the government to pay compensation, which, again, is exactly what sovereign immunity is supposed to prevent.
Right.
He even cited a specific case, Department of Army v. Blue Fox, to support his point.
Okay.
And in that case, the Supreme Court made it very clear that the APA's waiver doesn't cover injunctions that are essentially trying to enforce past due monetary obligations.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm assuming that the NGOs probably had their own legal precedents that they were using to back up their position.
They did. They pointed to a case called Bowen v. Massachusetts, where the Supreme Court actually upheld a district court judgment that had reversed the government's refusal to reimburse Massachusetts for some Medicaid expenses.
Oh, interesting. So it seems like at first glance they might have a pretty strong argument there if the Supreme Court has already said that a lower court can force the government to pay money in a similar case. Wouldn't that support the NGO's position here?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. Justice Alito actually distinguished the Bowen v. Massachusetts case by highlighting a key difference.
Okay.
In that case, the judgment didn't actually order any direct payment from the United States.
Yeah, okay.
It simply recognized that if a certain agency action was set aside, then the natural result of that would be that funds would have to be released.
Okay, so it's not about whether a court can indirectly lead to a payout. It's about whether they can directly order the government to hand over a specific amount of money.
Exactly. And to further support his argument, Justice Alito brought up another case, Great West Life and Annuity, Henry v. Knudsen, and this case clarified that Bowen doesn't apply to situations where a judge is trying to enforce past due monetary obligations, which is what we seem to have here.
Okay, so Justice Alito has gone through all the relevant case law here and kind of laid out his argument against the district court's actions. But if I remember correctly, he also expressed some concern about the practical implications of this order, beyond just the legal technicalities.
You're absolutely right. Justice Alito argued that forcing the government to pay out $2 billion was basically using a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Yeah.
He argued that the order was overly broad and that it violated this basic legal principle that a federal court shouldn't impose a remedy that's more burdensome than necessary to actually address the plaintiff's injuries.
So he's basically saying that there might have been other ways to go about this that weren't so extreme and could have still ensured that the NGOs got the funding that they were owed.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
He pointed out that the district court issued this really blanket order that covered, all the work done before the initial TRO, even for organizations that weren't part of the lawsuit. And he questioned the need for such a sweeping remedy, especially since the government had already expressed a willingness to figure out exactly how much money was owed to the specific respondents and just pay them directly.
So it sounds like he thought a more targeted approach would have been much more appropriate in this case. And didn't the government also argue that once that $2 billion is out the door, there's pretty much no chance of getting it back?
Yeah, they did. They argued that if they ended up winning the case later on recovering, that money from all these different organizations would be virtually impossible. And this ties into the whole argument about irreparable harm.
Right.
Alito pointed out that the government stood to lose a huge amount of taxpayer money, while the potential harm to the NGOs could have been minimized if the Court of Appeals had stepped in more quickly to address the case.
Right. So he's saying that if the higher courts had acted faster, they could resolve the NGO's concerns without needing to resort to this, kind of extreme measure.
Precisely. He even argued that if the government had ultimately won the case on the sovereign immunity issue, neither the NGOs nor the people that they serve would have suffered any harm at all because those paused payments would have been deemed lawful.
Right.
It's all about finding the most balanced and legally sound way to resolve these types of disputes.
Well, he definitely lays out a compelling argument for why he thinks the district court's order was problematic. But for you, as someone who's been following this case closely, what do you think is like the biggest takeaway, the most important takeaway from Justice Alito's dissent?
I think the most striking aspect of his dissent is his emphasis on how important it is to respect the boundaries of judicial power.
Okay.
He's not just arguing against this one particular order. He's advocating for a more restrained approach to judicial authority.
Right.
One that recognizes the importance of these established legal doctrines like sovereign immunity.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reminder that even when there are urgent situations, courts need to operate within the framework of the law and they need to avoid overstepping.
It's a crucial point because the judiciary plays this, vital role in our system of government. But it's not supposed to be this freewheeling branch that can just act without any constraints.
Exactly. And I think this case really highlights what can happen when a judge, even with good intentions, makes a decision that could undermine those fundamental principles.
It's a reminder that even in a democracy, there need to be checks and balances to prevent any one person or entity from having too much power.
Absolutely. And the ability of higher courts to review and potentially overturn lower court decisions is really crucial for maintaining the integrity of our legal system. Justice Alito's dissent is, in essence, a plea to preserve that system and make sure that it continues to function the way it should.
Right. It's like saying, hold on, let's not let this one just slip through the cracks here. We need to make sure we set a clear precedent so this doesn't keep happening.
Exactly. He's raising a red flag, and he's urging everyone to consider the long-term consequences of this case for how judicial decisions are made going forward.
It's a powerful message that really goes beyond this one particular case and speaks to the very core of how our government works.
It does, and I think it highlights how important it is to have an informed citizenry who understands these issues and can engage in, these thoughtful discussions about how to maintain that balance of power.
Well said. This has been a really eye-opening deep dive, to say the least. But before we come up for air, I do have one final question for you. What's the one lingering thought, the one question that you hope will stay with our listeners long after they've finished this episode?
Well, here's a question for you. How do we make sure that important legal doctrines like sovereign immunity are applied consistently and fairly, especially when the stakes are so high?
Hmm.
It's definitely something to think about as we navigate this increasingly complex legal landscape where these kinds of questions are becoming more and more common.
It really challenges us to think critically about the role of the judiciary, the limits of government power, and how that delicate balance really keeps our democracy functioning.
And it reminds us that we all have a stake in these discussions, and it's up to all of us to make sure that our voices are heard.
This has been an incredibly insightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Everyone, will see you next time for another exploration of the most fascinating stories and ideas that are shaping our world.
Yeah, it really makes you realize that, these legal battles aren't just some dry, abstract concept. They have real-world consequences for people and organizations out there in the world. And speaking of which, we've talked a lot about, Justice Alito and the government's perspective, but
Yeah.
I would love to hear more about the actual NGOs involved in this case. Who are they? What kind of work do they do? And why was this funding so crucial for them? Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. It's important to remember the human side of this whole legal battle. The group of NGOs that sued the government is called the AIDS Vaccine Advocacy Coalition, AVVAS for short. And even though the name mentions AIDS vaccines, the case itself isn't really focused on that issue. It's a much broader coalition of businesses and nonprofits that rely on foreign aid for all sorts of different projects.
So we're talking about organizations that are working on the front lines of, global health development, humanitarian assistance, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Mm.
These are the groups that are working to improve lives in some of the most challenging places around the world. They might be providing healthcare, education, clean water, or supporting economic development projects. And they really rely on this foreign aid to fund these critical initiatives. So any disruption to that funding can have this ripple effect that's felt, far beyond the courtroom.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine a sudden halt to their funding could really, throw a wrench into their entire operations.
Absolutely. Think about it. They have staff to pay. They have programs to run, and they have commitments to the communities they serve. A sudden loss of funding could force them to scale back their operations, lay off employees, or even, shut down entirely. And that's why they argued that the judge's swift action was necessary to prevent that kind of irreparable harm.
Right. It sounds like they were really caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they have these urgent needs. The people they serve are depending on them. And on the other hand, they're facing this legal battle with the government over sovereign immunity.
It's a tough spot to be in for sure, and it highlights the tension that can sometimes arise between the government's responsibility to manage taxpayer dollars and the critical role that these NGOs play in addressing these really important global challenges.
Yeah, it's a complicated balancing act, to be sure. But getting back to the legal side of things for a second, I'm curious to get your take on the broader implications of this whole case, beyond the specifics of this one dispute over foreign aid. What kind of precedent could this set for future challenges to government actions?
Yeah, that's a question that a lot of legal experts are really kind of grappling with right now. And this case has definitely raised concerns about a potential increase in district court injunctions that target the government.
Mm-hmm.
If a single judge can essentially force the government to pay out, billions of dollars with a TRO, it could open the floodgates for similar actions in other areas as well.
Right. So it's not just about this one case. It's about the potential for this kind of ripple effect across the entire legal landscape.
Exactly. It's about setting a precedent that could have these far-reaching consequences for how the government operates and how courts respond to challenges against government actions.
It's almost like this constitutional chess match where each branch of government is trying to maneuver within the rules while also kind of testing the boundaries of their power.
That's a great way to put it. And this case really highlights the need for these clear distinctions between TROs and preliminary injunctions. Remember, TROs are supposed to be these very temporary measures that are used in emergency situations. They're not designed to be a way for a single judge to basically make a final ruling on a really complex issue.
Right. So part of the takeaway here is that we need to make sure that these legal tools are being used appropriately and not as shortcuts to try to bypass the normal legal process.
Exactly. It's about upholding the rule of law and ensuring that everyone is playing by the rules, including the government and the judiciary.
Right. It's a reminder that our system of government is built on this delicate balance of power, and that balance needs to be very carefully maintained.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. Thank you to everyone who joined us on this journey through the twists and turns of this fascinating Supreme Court case. But before we sign off, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question.
I'm all ears.
What do you think this case tells us about the evolving relationship between the different branches of government, especially in today's, rapidly changing world? Is this a sign of things to come, or is it just an isolated incident? It's definitely something to think about as we continue to navigate the complexities of our political and legal systems. Thanks again for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration of the most fascinating stories and ideas that are shaping our world.